Let's say you have made a new electric vehicle whose top speed is 246.29 kilometers per hour. What makes more sense to claim in your brochures, in your site in general? The exact number, 246.29, or maybe 246, or maybe round it off to 245 or 240. What do you think? Hi, Amrit here, co-founder CoreVoice, and welcome to another episode of CoreInsights. In this episode, I am sharing a paper from Journal of Consumer Psychology called The Numerical Precision Effect. So the authors of this paper did a study and with a bunch of technological products, and their broad hypothesis was that whether or not you use precision, like the decimal values for the numbers that are being used for some attributes, depends upon whether the attribute is commonly understood, well understood, or they are unfamiliar attributes, and I'll explain that. So in the first study, they showed about 260 students a photo and a demo video of a smartphone gimbal. Those of you who don't know what a gimbal is, it is that 3-axis stabilized thing. You put the phone, and if you travel with the phone, the shots are very stationary. Now, the total group, 260 students, they were divided into 4 subgroups. The first group were only told about the tilt, pan and roll angles of the gimbal, which is sort of an unfamiliar attribute. So 1/4 of the group were given rounded off values, like if the angle of tilt was 238 degrees, they were set 240, and the other 1/4 group were given the exact values, the precise values, 238 degrees, 316 degrees. The other two 1/4 groups, in one group they were told the exact battery life, which was 9.6 hours, and the other group was given a rounded off battery life, which was 10 hours. So we have these 2x2 tests that was done. So when a familiar attribute, which is a battery life, in that case, whether you said 9.6 hours or 10 hours, after that, when a willingness to pay survey was done, there was no significant difference between the willingness to pay. But when the two groups were supposed to decide or the rate their willingness to pay for the same gimbal by judging an attribute which was not that familiar, like tilt, roll and pan angles, then the group which considered precise values was 40% more willing to pay than the group that was given rounded up values, like 238 degrees versus 248 degrees. Massive difference. Likewise, they did one more test with the foldable phones. So the unfamiliar attribute of a foldable phone was how many times the phone can be folded, while the familiar attribute was the display size. Again, overall about 240 students and 4 groups were formed. When a precise value was given for a familiar attribute like the display screen size, whether you round it off or whether you don't round it off, the willingness to pay was mostly the same. But between those two groups that were considering an unfamiliar attribute, how many times the phone can be folded, one group was told that the phone can be folded 55,000 times. The group which was given the exact number 54986 were again about 40% more likely to buy that foldable phone. I found this pretty fascinating, and in fact these guys went and did a bunch of more tests to figure out how much precision is the ideal precision, or in other words, how much calibration gives best result. This only applies when you're talking about an unfamiliar attribute. So let's say accuracy is an attribute, and we have 94.287% versus 95.000%. So between 94 and 95%, between 94.287% and 95.000%, and 94.2% and 95%. Which sort of a combination led to most drastic impact? It was found that 94 and 95% not so much. Again, 94.287 and 95.000%. If you go very high calibration, the difference was not so much between willingness to pay. But when you have 94.2% and 95%, the willingness to pay is significantly higher if the attribute is unfamiliar and we give a precise figure like 94.2%. So too much of calibration and going into too much detail is also not very helpful. Hope you love this insight like I did, and at CoreVoice, because we do brand and marketing and growth strategies for startups and create a lot of content around that, it's important for us to know these small things, like when to use what sort of a precision with which number to get the maximum impact. I mean, these things are well studied and the science exists, so why not be aware of them? See you in yet another episode of CoreInsights.